The dust hadn't settled on Main Street when Sheriff Jake Morrison heard the gunshot echo through Redemption Creek. His spurs clinked against the wooden boardwalk as he rushed toward the saloon, where a crowd was already gathering like vultures around fresh carrion. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and the smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the desert air. Through the batwing doors, he could see folks huddled around something on the floor, their faces pale as winter snow. "Move aside," he commanded, his weathered hand resting on the grip of his Colt 45. Inside the Silver Dollar Saloon, the body of Jeremiah Blackwood lay sprawled across the poker table, cards scattered like fallen leaves around his still form. Blood seeped into the green felt, mixing with spilled whiskey and broken dreams. The town's wealthiest cattle baron had been shot clean through the heart, his expensive suit now ruined beyond repair. His cold eyes stared at the tin ceiling, reflecting the flickering light of the oil lamps. The poker chips he'd been counting just moments before were now stained crimson with his life's blood. "Anyone see who did this?" Morrison asked, scanning the frightened faces around him. The bartender, a nervous man named Pete Collins, wiped his hands repeatedly on his stained apron, unable to meet the sheriff's steel-gray eyes. 3 local ranchers stood frozen near the bar, their drinks forgotten in their trembling hands. Martha Henley, the saloon's piano player, sat hunched over her instrument, tears streaming down her painted cheeks. Even the usual crowd of drifters and card sharks had gone silent as tombstones. "Reckon it was that new fella," whispered Doc Patterson, adjusting his spectacles with shaking fingers. He pointed toward the back exit where the door hung open, creaking in the evening breeze. "Stranger rode into town this morning, been asking questions about Blackwood all day long." The old physician had seen plenty of violence in his 40 years in Redemption Creek, but murder still made his stomach turn. "Saw him talking to Mary Elizabeth down at the general store, seemed mighty interested in Blackwood's business dealings." Morrison knelt beside the body, studying the wound and the positioning of the furniture around the table. The shot had come from close range, probably while Blackwood was seated and focused on his cards. There were no signs of a struggle, suggesting the victim had trusted his killer enough to let them get near. The sheriff's trained eye caught something glinting beneath the overturned chair, a silver button with an intricate design. "Pete, who else was in here when it happened?" he asked, carefully pocketing the evidence. The bartender's voice cracked like a whip in the tense silence. "Just the usual crowd, Sheriff. Doc, the Hendricks brothers, Martha here at the piano." He gestured nervously toward each person as he spoke their names. "And that stranger you mentioned went by the name of Cole Daniels." Pete's hands shook as he reached for a bottle of whiskey, needing liquid courage to continue his story. "So they was all playing cards real peaceful-like. Then Blackwood started arguing with someone about some old debt." "What kind of debt?" Morrison's voice cut through the smoky air like a blade through silk. The townspeople exchanged meaningful glances, the kind that spoke of shared secrets and buried truths. Blackwood had been a powerful man in these parts, owning most of the cattle ranches and half the businesses in town. But power made enemies, and in the Wild West, enemies had a way of settling scores with hot lead. The sheriff knew that behind every fortune in this territory lay stories that decent folks preferred to forget. Martha finally found her voice, though it trembled like autumn leaves in a strong wind. "He was talking about something that happened 15 years ago, back during the cattle wars." She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, smearing her rouge in the process. "Said someone owed him more than money, owed him blood for what they'd done." The piano player had heard plenty of confessions and secrets over the years, men's tongues loosened by whiskey and cards. That stranger, Cole, he went white as a sheet when Blackwood started talking about old debts and family honor. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds rolling down the empty street like ghostly messengers. Morrison stood slowly, his joints protesting after years of hard living and harder justice. The silver button in his pocket felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of buried secrets and long-forgotten sins. He'd been sheriff of Redemption Creek for 12 years, and he'd learned that in small towns, the past had a way of catching up with folks. "Nobody leaves town until I say so," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of law and order. "How think you know who's guilty?" Doc Patterson asked, his medical bag clutched tightly in his gnarled hands. The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying campfire, heavy with implication and unspoken truths. Morrison's weathered face remained impassive as he surveyed the scene one final time, memorizing every detail for the investigation ahead. The killer was still among them. He could feel it in his bones like an old wound before a storm, And when morning came, he'd start digging into secrets that some folks would kill to keep buried. Dawn broke over Redemption Creek like a wound across the sky, painting the desert landscape in shades of blood and gold. Sheriff Morrison had spent a sleepless night in his office, studying the silver button and trying to piece together the fragments of conversation he'd heard. The intricate design looked familiar, but memories from 15 years past were like shadows at noon, hard to grasp and harder still to trust. He'd sent word to the neighboring towns about Cole Daniels, but so far no one had heard of a man by that name. The stranger had vanished into the night like smoke on the wind. Mary Elizabeth Winters stood behind the counter of her general store, arranging bolts of fabric with trembling hands. She was a handsome woman of 35, with auburn hair and green eyes that had seen too much sorrow for someone so young. When Morrison pushed through the door, the bell above chimed like a funeral knell, making her jump like a startled deer. "Morning, Sheriff," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The dark circles under her eyes told the story of another sleepless night in a town full of them. "Mary Elizabeth, I need to ask you about that stranger," Morrison said, removing his hat out of respect for the lady. His weathered hands turned the brim nervously as he searched her face for any sign of deception or fear. "Pete Collins said he saw Cole Daniels talking to you yesterday about Blackwood's business." The morning light streaming through the windows cast harsh shadows across both their faces, making them look older than their years. What exactly did he want to know? The woman's hands stilled on the fabric, and for a moment the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, like water breaking through a dam. "He asked about the Hartwell family, Sheriff. Wanted to know what happened to them during the range wars." Her voice caught on the name, and Morrison noticed the way her wedding ring caught the light as she twisted it nervously. "Said he was writing for some eastern newspaper, doing a story on the old cattle barons." Morrison's blood ran cold at the mention of the Hartwell name. Thomas Hartwell had been a small rancher who tried to stand up to Blackwood's land grabbing schemes 15 years ago. The man had died under mysterious circumstances, along with his wife and eldest son, leaving only a younger boy who disappeared after the funerals. "What did you tell him?" the sheriff asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Mary Elizabeth had been sweet on young Benjamin Hartwell before the tragedy struck their family like lightning from a clear sky. "I told him the truth," she whispered, tears beginning to form in her emerald eyes. How Blackwood's men burned them out, how they died in that fire that everybody knew wasn't no accident. She pulled a handkerchief from her apron pocket, the same lace pattern Martha used at the saloon. How little Benjamin swore vengeance on his family's grave before he rode out of town on his 13th birthday. The weight of 15 years of guilt and regret seemed to settle on her shoulders like a heavy winter coat. Meanwhile, at the Silver Dollar Saloon, the Hendricks brothers sat nursing their morning whiskey with hands that shook like autumn leaves. Samuel and Joshua had been Blackwood's enforcers during the cattle wars, doing the dirty work that kept the barons' hands clean. They'd grown soft and prosperous over the years, but fear had a way of awakening old reflexes and older memories. "So you reckon that stranger was really Benjamin Hartwell?" Samuel asked his brother, his voice barely audible above the sound of their breathing. "Boy swore he'd come back someday and settle accounts." Joshua stared into his glass as if searching for answers in the amber liquid. He was the older of the two, with grey streaking his brown hair and lines etched deep around his eyes. "Been 15 years, Sam. Boy would be a man grown now, probably wouldn't even recognize him." But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at his gut like a hungry wolf. That silver button the sheriff found, though, looked mighty familiar. The Hartwell family had been known for their fancy clothes and jewelry, back when they had money to spend on such things. Doc Patterson made his rounds that morning with unusual haste, checking on patients who didn't really need checking and avoiding eye contact with everyone he met. He'd been the one to examine the bodies after the Hartwell fire, the one who'd signed the death certificates without asking too many questions. The weight of his cowardice had grown heavier with each passing year, like a tumor in his chest that no medicine could cure. When he saw Morrison approaching his office, the old physician's hands began to shake worse than they had since the war. "Sheriff," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Terrible business about poor Jeremiah." Morrison studied the doctor's face with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years reading guilt and innocence in human expressions. "Doc, I need to ask you about the Hartwell investigation," he said, settling into the chair across from Patterson's desk. The office smelled of carbolic acid and old secrets, dust motes dancing in the morning sunlight like tiny ghosts. "You examined the bodies after the fire. What did you really find?" The question hung between them like a loaded gun, heavy with the weight of buried truth and the promise of revelation to come. Doc Patterson's face went white as fresh snow, and his hands trembled so badly he had to clasp them together to steady them. "I found what I was supposed to find, Sheriff," he whispered, his voice breaking like a man confessing his sins before the gallows. "3 bodies burned beyond recognition, just like Blackwood wanted me to find." The truth spilled out of him like blood from a mortal wound, 15 years of guilt finally breaking free. But Thomas Hartwell had been shot in the back before the fire started, and his wife had a knife wound in her chest. The old physician buried his face in his hands, unable to meet Morrison's steady gaze. "And the boy?" Morrison asked, though his heart was already racing with the terrible certainty of what he was about to hear. The silver button in his vest pocket seemed to burn against his chest like a brand. "What about young Benjamin?" The morning light streaming through the window cast long shadows across the doctor's confession, making the small office feel like a courtroom where justice had been delayed but not denied. The tick of the wall clock marked the seconds like a countdown to revelation. "There was no third body," Patterson choked out, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Just 2 adults and some animal bones Blackwood's men threw in to make the count right." His voice rose to a whisper shout, decades of suppressed horror finally finding its voice. "The boy escaped somehow, probably saw what happened to his parents and ran for his life." The doctor reached for his bottle of medicinal whiskey with hands that shook like a man with palsy. "Blackwood paid me $500 to keep quiet and sign the death certificates without questions." Morrison stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his gun belt. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place like dominoes in a strong wind, each revelation leading inevitably to the next. "So Benjamin Hartwell is still alive," he said, more to himself than to the trembling physician. "Came back to settle an old debt with the man who murdered his family." The sheriff's weathered face showed no emotion, but inside, a cold rage was building like a winter storm. "And you helped cover it up for blood money." Outside, the town was beginning to stir with the usual morning activities, but an undercurrent of fear ran through every conversation and sideways glance. Word of the murder had spread like wildfire, and with it came whispered speculations about the mysterious stranger who'd vanished in the night. At the livery stable, old Pete Henderson was telling anyone who'd listen about the fine horse the stranger had been riding, a black stallion with white markings that matched the description of a colt that had belonged to the Hartwell family years ago. "Recognized that horse soon as I seen it," he declared, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Martha Henley hadn't slept a wink since the shooting, her mind churning with memories of the conversation she'd overheard between Blackwood and the stranger. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, trying to make sense of the fragments of that fateful exchange. "You killed my family for their land," the stranger had said, his voice carrying the weight of years of planning and patient hatred. "And now you're going to pay for every drop of blood you spilled." Blackwood had laughed then, the sound cruel and confident, not knowing he was about to breathe his last. The Hendricks brothers had barricaded themselves in their house on the edge of town, Winchester rifles loaded and ready across their knees. They'd been part of Blackwood's private army during the cattle wars, and they knew that if Benjamin Hartwell had really returned, they would be next on his list. Samuel paced the floor like a caged wolf, jumping at every sound from outside. "We should have killed that boy 15 years ago," he muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the morning chill. "Should have made sure the whole family was dead and buried." "Maybe we still got time to fix this," Joshua replied, though his voice lacked conviction. He'd been having nightmares about the Hartwell fire for years, seeing the faces of the dead in every shadow and flame. "Morrison's a good sheriff, but he's just one man against someone who's had 15 years to plan his revenge." The sound of hoofbeats on the road made both brothers freeze, their rifles coming up to firing position. "Could be him coming for us right now," Samuel whispered, his face pale as morning frost. But the rider who approached their house was Mary Elizabeth Winters, her horse lathered with sweat from the hard ride out from town. She dismounted quickly, her green dress billowing around her like storm clouds. "Samuel, Joshua," she called out, her voice carrying a note of desperate urgency. "The sheriff knows about the fire, about what really happened to the Hartwell family." She'd always suspected the truth, had seen the guilt in their eyes at Sunday services for years. "Benjamin's come home, and he's not going to stop with just Blackwood." When the door burst open, every secret in town came to light like a flash of lightning illuminating a dark landscape. But it wasn't Benjamin Hartwell who stood in the doorway. It was Sheriff Morrison, his badge gleaming in the morning sun, and his Colt 45 drawn and ready. Behind him stood a figure that made both brothers' blood run cold, a tall man with familiar eyes and a silver button missing from his vest. "Benjamin Hartwell," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of justice finally served. "Meet the Hendricks brothers, the men who helped murder your family and burn your home to cover their tracks." The confrontation in the Hendricks parlor was electric, with 15 years of buried hatred and long-awaited justice. Benjamin Hartwell stood tall and straight, no longer the frightened 13-year-old boy who'd fled into the desert night. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd spent years preparing for this moment, learning to shoot, to track, to survive. "You remember me now, don't you, Sam?" he said, his voice steady as bedrock despite the emotion burning in his eyes. The silver buttons on his vest caught the morning light, all except one that now rested in the sheriff's evidence pouch. Samuel Hendricks tried to raise his rifle, but his hands shook too badly to aim properly. The weight of his guilt had grown heavier with each passing year, and now it crushed him like a boulder on his chest. "We was just following orders," he stammered, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Blackwood said you was all rustlers, said the law would never touch you." His brother Joshua sat frozen in his chair, the fight gone out of him like air from a punctured bellows. "We never meant for it to go so far, Ben. You got to believe that." "You burned my parents alive," Benjamin said, each word falling like hammer blows on an anvil. His hand rested on the grip of his Colt, but he made no move to draw it. "You stole their land, destroyed their dreams, and left me with nothing but hatred to keep me warm at night." Morrison watched the exchange carefully, ready to intervene if violence seemed imminent. "For 15 years I've dreamed of this moment, of looking into your eyes and seeing the fear you put in my father's heart." Mary Elizabeth stepped forward, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "Benjamin, I knew it was you the moment you walked into my store," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "You have your mother's eyes and your father's stubborn jaw." She'd loved him once in the innocent way of childhood sweethearts before tragedy had torn their world apart. "I've kept flowers on their graves every Sunday for 15 years, waiting for you to come home." The confession hung between them like a bridge across the chasm of lost time. "The law failed your family once, Benjamin," Morrison said, his voice firm but understanding. "Don't make me fail them again by becoming a killer yourself." The sheriff had seen too many good men destroyed by the poison of revenge, watched justice turn to vengeance and vengeance to damnation. "These men will stand trial for what they did. I give you my word on that." He gestured toward the Hendricks brothers, who sat slumped in defeat. "Doc Patterson's already confessed to falsifying the death certificates, and with his testimony, we can finally give your parents the justice they deserve." Benjamin's hand slowly moved away from his gun, the tension in the room ebbing like tide from a beach. "I've carried this hatred so long, I don't know who I am without it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The years of planning and preparation had led to this moment, but now that it had arrived, the weight of his burden felt crushing rather than liberating. "I became Cole Daniels because Benjamin Hartwell died in that fire with his family." Tears ran down his cheeks, the first he'd shed since he was 13 years old, and running for his life through the desert darkness. "Benjamin Hartwell didn't die," Mary Elizabeth said softly, reaching out to touch his arm with gentle fingers. "He just went away for a while, learning how to be strong enough to come home." Her voice carried the warmth of old love and new hope, like sunrise after the longest night. "Your parents would be proud of the man you've become, proud that you chose justice over revenge when the moment came." The morning light streaming through the windows seemed brighter somehow, as if the shadows of 15 years were finally beginning to lift. 6 months later, the trial of the Hendricks brothers and the posthumous charges against Jeremiah Blackwood made headlines throughout the territory. Doc Patterson's testimony, combined with evidence Morrison had uncovered, finally brought justice to the Hartwell family murders. Benjamin had stayed in Redemption Creek, working to rebuild the ranch that had once been his family's pride and joy. The town, freed from Blackwood's iron grip, began to flourish as honest businesses replaced corruption and fear. Mary Elizabeth often visited the new ranch, helping Benjamin plant gardens where his mother's flowers had once bloomed. As Sheriff Morrison walked his evening rounds, he reflected on the strange turns that justice could take in the Wild West. Sometimes the guilty escaped punishment for decades, but the truth had a way of surfacing like underground water in the desert. The silver button he'd found at the crime scene now rested in the evidence room, a reminder that even the smallest clues could unravel the biggest lies. Redemption Creek was living up to its name at last, offering second chances to those brave enough to seek them. Standing on the porch of the rebuilt Hartwell Ranch, Benjamin watched the sun set over the land his parents had died defending. The graves in the family cemetery bore new headstones now, with proper epitaphs that honored their memory instead of hiding their murder. "You think you know who's guilty?" he murmured to the evening wind, remembering the sheriff's question from that fateful night in the saloon. Sometimes guilt wore many faces, and sometimes redemption required not just justice, but the courage to forgive, starting with oneself.